In the sweltering summer of 1847, under a canopy of ancient oaks dripping with Spanish moss, a peculiar sight unfolded on the sprawling hawthorn plantation in rural Georgia. Dozens of children, small, frail figures with skin like polished ebony, lay huddled in the shadows of the slave quarters, their bodies racked by a fever that had swept through like a biblical plague. The air was thick with the moans of the afflicted, and the overseers, grim-faced men with whips coiled at their belts, whispered of divine judgment or poisoned wells. But one man, a slave known only as Elias the Healer, moved among them with quiet defiance. In just 3 weeks, against all odds and before the dawn of modern medicine, he would cure 87 of these children with a method so forbidden, so rooted in the hidden knowledge of the enslaved, that it would be buried for over a century. What Elias did that summer wasn't just medicine. It was an act of rebellion, a spark in the darkness of a system built on chains and silence. Before we go on, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The hawthorn plantation stretched across miles of fertile red clay, a kingdom of cotton and cane where the Hawthorne family had reigned for 3 generations. Elias arrived there in chains 15 years earlier, purchased from a coastal trader who claimed he was a runaway from a Carolina rice field. But whispers among the enslaved told a different tale. Elias had been a free man of color in New Orleans, schooled in the arts of healing by Creole midwives and African root doctors, until a false accusation of theft stripped him of everything. On Hawthorne, he was assigned to the healer's cabin, a ramshackle hut stocked with whatever herbs the overseer deemed fit, mostly willow bark and stale laudanum pilfered from the big house. Elias's hands, scarred from fieldwork but steady as a surgeon's, tended to the cuts, fevers, and broken spirits of his people. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes sharp, taking in the rhythms of the land and the unspoken fears that bound them all. That fateful summer, the fever struck without warning. It began with the children, those fragile lives born into bondage, their bodies already weakened by meager rations and endless labor in the fields. By dawn's light, 20 had fallen, their skin hot as branding irons, delirium twisting their young faces. The plantation owner, Jeremiah Hawthorne, a man whose fortune was built on the sweat of 400 souls, paced the veranda of his columned mansion, his face pale beneath a sweat-stained hat. "This is no ordinary egg," he muttered to his wife Lydia, a sharp-eyed woman who managed the household with an iron ledger. Rumors spread like kudzu, tainted water from the creek, a curse from the conjure women in the quarters, or worse, deliberate sabotage by the enslaved, weary of their yoke. The overseers acted swiftly, as they always did. They isolated the sick in a barn on the plantation's edge, away from the valuable hands who picked the cotton. No doctor from town was summoned. Such men charged fees that rivaled a season's yield. And besides, what outsider would meddle in the affairs of a place like Hawthorne? Instead, they turned to Elias. "Fix this, boy," the head overseer snarled, shoving him toward the barn with a lantern and a warning. "Or you'll join them in the ground." Elias nodded, his face impassive, but inside, a storm brewed. He had seen fevers like this before, in the swamps of Louisiana, where yellow jack and malaria claimed lives by the dozen. But this was different. The children's eyes held not just pain, but a deeper poison, something insidious that lingered in their bloodlines. As Elias worked through the nights, brewing teas from sassafras roots and feverfew gathered in secret from the woods, he uncovered the first threads of a darker truth. The fever wasn't born of the land alone. It festered from within the plantation's very heart. He noticed patterns in the afflicted. All were children of the breeding program, a whispered policy enforced by the Hawthorns to increase their holdings without the cost of new purchases. Lydia Hawthorne with her meticulous records, had long selected pairings among the enslaved, strong men with resilient women, to produce offspring that could labor from dawn till dusk. But Elias saw the toll. Malnutrition masked as discipline, forced separations that shattered families, and something more sinister, in the delirious ramblings of a young girl named Mira, barely 10, he heard fragments of horror, nights when the big house's lights burned late, and children were taken for examinations by a visiting physician from Savannah, a man who peddled tonics laced with mercury and arsenic. Elias's method emerged not from books, but from the oral traditions passed down through generations of the enslaved. It was an illegal trick, as the overseers would later call it, a blend of native herbs, African rituals disguised as prayer, and a defiance of the plantation's rules against gathering beyond the fences. He started with a decoction of willow bark and dogwood, boiled under the cover of moonless skies, to break the fever's grip, but the true cure lay in restoring what the system had stolen: community. He gathered the surviving children in circles, their hands linked, chanting low songs of ancestry that echoed from the holds of slave ships. Nutrition followed. Stolen yams and wild greens slipped into the barn by kin who risked the lash. In 3 weeks, the miracle unfolded. 87 children rose, their eyes clearing, bodies mending. The overseers marveled, crediting Hawthorne's good management, but Elias knew the cost. For every life saved, secrets deepened, buried under layers of fear and complicity. Yet, as the fever receded, so did the fragile peace. Jeremiah Hawthorne, suspicious of Elias's success, ordered the healer's cabin searched. What they found, a small pouch of unfamiliar roots, a carved talisman, sealed his fate. Accused of witchcraft, a charge that masked deeper fears of empowered slaves, Elias vanished one autumn night. His body was never recovered, listed in the ledgers as run off. The children he saved grew into adults, their stories fragmented, passed in hushed tones around evening fires. For decades, Hawthorne Plantation thrived, its ledgers pristine, its horrors erased from official records. The town archives spoke of bountiful harvests and pious landowners, but the silence was deafening, a communal veil drawn over the graves of truth. It would take more than a century for the first cracks to appear. In 1962, during a routine survey of the old Hawthorne lands, now subdivided for suburban sprawl, a backhoe unearthed a shallow pit near the former slave quarters. Bones, small and brittle, mingled with shards of pottery and rusted chains. Archaeologists labeled it a cemetery, but locals remembered the fever and whispers of the healer who defied death. The real revelation came later, in dusty court files unsealed after a descendant's lawsuit over land rights. There, amid yellowed pages, lay Lydia Hawthorne's private journal, hidden in an attic trunk and forgotten until a great-niece's curiosity unearthed it in 2018. The entries detailed not just the breeding edicts, but the doctor's visits, experiments on the children, disguised as health checks, that bred the very fevers Elias had cured. Those bones, those words, pulled back the curtain on a tragedy woven into the fabric of the South. Elias's illegal trick wasn't sorcery. It was survival, a testament to the resilience of the oppressed against a machine of erasure. But as we delve deeper, the question lingers. What other cures were silenced? What other lives lost to the plantation's shadow? The Hawthorne legacy endures, not in glory, but in the echoes of those it broke. As the summer heat clung to the Georgia lowlands like a shroud, the Hawthorne Plantation pulsed with an uneasy rhythm. The cotton fields, vast and unrelenting, demanded every able body, their white bowls a mocking symbol of prosperity built on suffering. Elias the healer, now the reluctant savior of the fever-stricken children, moved through the days with calculated caution. His success in the barn had bought him a fragile reprieve, but the overseer's eyes followed him like hawks circling prey. Whispers slithered through the quarters. Elias had called on spirits from the old world, or worse, poisoned the well to weaken the master's hold. Yet, among the enslaved, a quiet reverence grew. Mothers who had lost infants to earlier plagues slipped him pouches of dried herbs, their gratitude unspoken but profound. Elias's illegal trick, as the overseers derisively termed it, was no single potion or incantation, but a tapestry woven from forbidden knowledge. It began in the shadowed hours before dawn, when he ventured beyond the plantation's barbed fences into the tangled underbrush. There, under the guise of foraging for the big house's kitchen, he gathered what the land offered freely: the bitter bark of the chinaberry tree, leaves of the sarsaparilla vine that twisted like veins through the soil, and roots of the mayapple plucked from damp hollows where sunlight rarely pierced. These were not the tame remedies approved by white apothecaries. They were echoes of African pharmacopoeia, blended with the herbal lore of indigenous healers who had once roamed these woods before the plantations swallowed them whole. Elias knew the risks. Overseers patrolled the borders with dogs and shotguns, but the children's lives hung in the balance, their small frames etched with the scars of a system that viewed them as chattel, not souls. Back in the healer's cabin, a dim space lit by a single tallow candle, Elias prepared the cure in secrecy. He ground the herbs with a pestle carved from river stone, murmuring words in a dialect long banned on the plantation, phrases from the Yoruba tongues of his ancestors, disguised as Bible verses to any eavesdropper. The decoction simmered over a hidden fire pit, its steam carrying sense of earth and resilience. But medicine alone couldn't mend what the fever had exposed, the deep wounds inflicted by the Hawthorne's breeding program. Lydia Hawthorne, with her ledger of pairings, had orchestrated it like a grim harvest. Strong field hands were matched with women of childbearing years, their unions decreed not by affection, but by calculations of yield, how many laborers the next generation might provide. Families were fractured at whim. A father sold south if his temperament seemed unruly, a mother separated from her babe to nurse the master's own children. Elias had seen the results: children born into exhaustion, their bodies marked by the relentless cycle of labor and loss. The fever, Elias suspected, stemmed from this very cruelty. During his vigils in the barn, he pieced together the fragments from the survivors' fevered confessions. Young Mira, her voice a fragile thread, spoke of the doctor's nights when a gaunt man from Savannah arrived under cover of darkness, his black bag heavy with vials and syringes. He called himself a physician, but to the enslaved, he was a harbinger of torment. Under the guise of vaccinations or tonics to strengthen the stock, he administered substances that burned like fire in the veins. Experiments, Elias realized, to test limits of endurance, perhaps even to control fertility or suppress resistance. The fevers followed, not from contagion alone, but from the toxic residue lingering in malnourished bodies. Official records from the era, if they existed at all, glossed over such visits as routine health measures, a benevolence extended by enlightened owners. But in the quarters, the truth festered. The program wasn't just about numbers. It was a pact among the elite, a silent agreement to perpetuate bondage through bloodlines tainted by abuse. As the days blurred into weeks, Elias's method took hold. He doled out the herbal brews in measured sips, watching as the children's temperatures broke like gathering storms. But the cure demanded more than roots and rituals. It required reclaiming the stolen bonds of kinship. In the barn's dim confines, away from prying eyes, Elias organized the afflicted into small groups. They shared stories of grandparents who had walked the middle passage, their voices weaving a shield against despair. One boy, no older than 8, recounted his mother's song of the ancestors, a melody that spoke of rivers crossed and freedoms dreamed. These gatherings, forbidden under plantation rules that isolated the weak, fostered a spark of unity. Slaves from the fields smuggled in cornbread laced with wild onions, defying the rations that kept bodies compliant. Slowly, the 87 rose, first on trembling legs, then with tentative steps, their laughter a rebellion against the silence imposed upon them. Jeremiah Hawthorne observed from afar, his suspicion hardening into resolve. He had built his empire on control, every aspect calibrated to maximize profit while minimizing unrest. The breeding program, initiated by his father and refined under Lydia's watchful eye, had swelled their holdings without the expense of auctions. But Elias's intervention disrupted the order. Why had the children rallied around this healer, this outsider with eyes that saw too much? Rumors reached the big house of gatherings in the barn, of songs that sounded like plots. Lydia, ever the pragmatist, urged caution. Let him work his magic, Jeremiah. We need those hands for the fall picking. Yet, beneath her composure lay a deeper fear, the unraveling of secrets that could tarnish the Hawthorne name in the eyes of neighboring planters, those fellow architects of the South's shadowed economy. The community's complicity weighed heaviest in the quiet hours. Townfolk in the nearby village, descendants of indentured Scots and English yeomen, turned blind eyes to the plantation's inner workings. They traded cotton for goods, attended the Hawthorne's church suppers, and spoke in hushed tones of necessary measures to keep the Negroes in line. No one questioned the disappearances, the runaways who never surfaced, the illnesses that claimed the unproductive. Decades later, historians would unearth ledgers from county clerks, pristine documents that tallied bales and births but omitted the human cost. The breeding pacts, those clandestine agreements among owners to exchange stock, like livestock, were erased from public memory, surviving only in faded letters tucked into family Bibles or oral tales passed by firelight. Elias sensed the noose tightening. One evening, as he slipped back from the woods with a satchel of fresh herbs, an overseer ambushed him at the fence line. "What devilry you brewing out there?" "Healer!" the man growled, rifling through the pouch. Elias stood silent, his mind racing through escapes, a hidden path through the swamps, allies in the free black communities up north. But the children he had saved were his anchor. Abandoning them now would doom the fragile hope he had kindled. As the fever's shadow lifted, so did the veil on Hawthorne's underbelly, revealing not just survival, but the first glimmers of a resistance that the system would crush at any cost. The healer's trick had worked its wonder, but the true plague, the one of power and erasure, lingered, waiting to claim its due. With the fever's grip finally broken, the Hawthorne plantation exhaled a tentative calm, but the air hummed with unspoken threats, like the distant rumble of thunder over the Okefenokee swamp. Elias returned to his cabin under the watchful gaze of the overseers, his satchel of herbs confiscated and burned in a public pyre as a warning to all. The children he had pulled from the brink now scattered back to the fields, their small hands clutching bowls of cotton, as if the fragile miracle could be crushed at any moment. Yet in their eyes lingered a spark Elias had ignited, not just health, but a whisper of agency, a knowledge that the body's resilience could defy the chains imposed upon it. He moved among them still, tending minor ailments with glances and subtle nods, but the walls of surveillance closed tighter. Jeremiah Hawthorne, pacing the veranda with a tumbler of bourbon, confided in no one his growing unease. The healer's success had saved valuable property, yes, but at what cost to the order he held sacred? Deeper into the autumn of 1847, as the leaves turned brittle and the harvest wagons groaned under their loads, Elias began to unravel more threads of the plantation's concealed rot. It came through the women first, those bearers of the breeding program's burdens, whose bodies were treated as fertile soil for the Hawthorne's expansion. In the dim light of the wash-house, where laundry steamed and secrets were aired like damp linens, Elias overheard fragments from Sarah, a midwife among the enslaved, whose hands had delivered dozens under duress. She spoke in low tones to a cluster of field women, her voice laced with the weight of years. "They pair us like mules, but it's the doctor's touch that poisons the blood," she murmured, her eyes darting toward the big house. Sarah had assisted in those shadowed examinations, holding trembling children while the savannah physician probed and injected, all under Lydia's approving nod. "The tonics," Sarah confided, "were meant to enhance vigor, but they left lasting shadows, fevers that recurred in pregnancies, infants born too weak to cry." Elias pieced it together in the quiet of his nights, poring over stolen scraps of knowledge. The physician, a Dr. Harlan Voss, was no stranger to the planter class. He traveled the circuit of Georgia estates, offering services that blurred the line between medicine and control. In letters Elias glimpsed, tucked into the overseer's discarded saddlebag, Voss boasted of compounds derived from calomel and quinine, laced with heavier metals to temper the spirit of the young. It was a systematic cruelty, disguised as progress, ensuring the next generation of laborers remained docile, their resistances dulled before they could form. The breeding pacts extended beyond Hawthorne's fences. Neighboring owners like the Grimshaws and the Latimores exchanged promising stock in clandestine meetings at county fairs, their agreements sealed with handshakes and ledgers that never saw the light of official scrutiny. Lydia Hawthorne, with her sharp quill, documented it all in a private cipher. Entries like pairing 47B, Voss treatment administered, yield expected in spring. To the outside world, these were mere agricultural notes. To those enduring it, they were edicts of erasure. The human toll pressed upon Elias like an unseen yoke. He recalled the face of little Josiah, one of the 87, whose fevered dreams had revealed nights spent in the big house attic, bound for tests that left welts hidden beneath ragged shifts. Josiah's mother, sold away 2 harvests prior for speaking against a lashing, had left behind a locket with a faded daguerreotype, a rare token of family now clutched by the boy as talisman. These separations were the program's cruel architecture, children bred for endurance, then divided to prevent bonds that might foster rebellion. Elias's cure had mended bodies, but the emotional fractures ran deeper, manifesting in nightmares that echoed through the quarters like mournful winds. He gathered what he could in secret circles, not for incantations now, but for shared grief. Stories of ancestors who had resisted in Carolina swamps, their spirits a quiet fire against the cold machinery of bondage. Suspicion festered in the big house like mold in the cellars. Jeremiah, urged by Voss during a late-night visit, began interrogating the recovered children. "What did the healer give you?" he demanded of Mira in the yard, his voice a velvet threat. She stammered of teas and songs, her small frame shrinking under his shadow. Lydia intervened with calculated poise, suggesting Elias be monitored more closely, perhaps reassigned to the fields to break his influence. But the overseers, rough men hardened by their own precarious place in the hierarchy, harbored their own fears. One, a scarred veteran named Tate, confided in a tavern brawl miles from the plantation that Elias's methods smacked of conjure, rootwork that could turn against the masters. Rumors swirled. The healer had buried talismans at the field's edges to sap the cotton's yield, or whispered poisons into the ears of the young. These were the seeds of betrayal, sown by a system that pitted the oppressed against each other, ensuring silence through division. As October deepened, the first signs of retaliation emerged. A young man from the quarters, kin to one of the cured, was punished publicly for idleness, a whipping that left him broken, his cries a stark reminder of the cost of perceived defiance. Elias tended him in the dead of night, applying salves from his hidden stores, But the message was clear. The healer's reprieve was fleeting. He began planning his own shadows, mapping escape routes through the whispering pines, allying with a network of free blacks in the coastal marshes who ferried runaways north. Yet loyalty bound him. The children watched him with eyes that pleaded for more than survival, for a reckoning. The plantation's complicity extended to the town, where merchants tallied debts without question, and the preacher invoked providence on Hawthorne's benevolence from his pulpit. Official records, sparse as they were, painted a portrait of harmony, births tallied as assets, deaths as acts of God. No mention of Voss's visits, no trace of the pacts that traded lives like seed corn. In the healer's cabin, Elias etched his discoveries into a makeshift journal, bark pages bound with twine. Knowing it might never see daylight, he detailed the program's mechanics. How Lydia selected pairings based on Voss's assessments, how the fevers were a byproduct of experimental elixirs meant to engineer compliance. It was a denunciation in miniature, a testament to the enslaved's hidden intellect against the facade of savagery imposed upon them. But as the harvest moon rose, casting silver on the fields, Elias felt the noose draw near. An overseer's dog bayed in the distance, and footsteps crunched on the path. The cure had been a victory, pyrrhic and perilous, illuminating the plantation's core of darkness. The true plague, born of elite pacts and institutional blindness, demanded more than herbs to exorcise. It called for voices raised from the silence, even if they echoed only in memory for generations to come. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. The winter of 1847 settled over Hawthorne Plantation like a heavy fog, muting the clamor of the harvest into a somber hush. Frost rimed the cotton gins and the slave quarters alike, a brittle crust over wounds that refused to heal. Elias the healer, his once steady hands now trembling from the chill and the weight of what he knew, tended the fields by day, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The overseers had stripped his cabin bare, scattering his herbs to the wind as if to exercise the very idea of his knowledge. Yet, in the hidden folds of his clothing, he carried remnants, a single vial of distilled sarsaparilla essence, a talisman of bone wrapped in cloth. The children he had saved moved like ghosts among the laborers, their recoveries a secret they guarded with wide-eyed silence. But the plantation's pulse quickened with malice. Elias's discoveries deepened in those lean months, drawn from the reluctant confessions of the women who bore the breeding program's scars. In the pre-dawn gloom of the weaving shed, where looms clacked like judgmental tongues, he spoke with Eliza, a woman whose frame had been bent by repeated pairings decreed by Lydia Hawthorne. Her voice, roughened by years of field cries, carried the cadence of suppressed rage. The doctor's visits weren't for healing, she whispered, her fingers twisting yarn into knots as tight as her memories. They came after the pairings, when the babes were still in the womb, or fresh from it. Injections to make us stronger, they said, but it burned like judgment fire, leaving us weak for the next round. Eliza's eyes, dulled by loss, fixed on the floor. She had lost 3 children to fevers that mirrored the summer plague, their small forms claimed before they could walk. The program, she revealed, was no mere whim of the Hawthornes. It was a web spun among the elite, pacts forged in smoke-filled parlors where planters like Jeremiah traded promises of shared improvements to their human stock. These alliances, veiled in the language of commerce, extended far beyond Hawthorne's borders. Elias learned of them through fragments overheard in the overseer's barracks, where whiskey loosened tongues. The Grimshaw plantation to the east, with its iron-fisted mistress, had sent envoys bearing ledgers of selective breeds, proposing exchanges that ensured a steady flow of resilient laborers without the uncertainties of the auction block. Dr. Voss, the circuit-riding physician, served as the linchpin, his black bag a repository of elixirs designed to manipulate the very essence of life. Compounds that promised vigor but delivered frailty, fevers engineered to cull the weak and preserve the compliant. Lydia Hawthorne's role was pivotal. Her private notations, glimpsed once by a house servant who risked everything to share them, outlined quotas, Voss protocol on 12 pairings, monitor for yield. To the world beyond the gates, these were innovations in estate management, praised in agricultural journals as forward-thinking husbandry. But within the quarters, they were chains forged in the body, a systematic unraveling of families to prevent the rise of any collective will. The emotional fractures ran like hidden roots beneath the soil, surfacing in the quiet desperations of daily life. Elias saw it in the way young Mira clung to her sibling during evening chores, her small hand a barrier against the overseer's casual separations. The girl, once delirious with fever, now woke screaming from dreams of the big house attic, where Voss's examinations had left invisible marks, bruises on the spirit that no herb could soothe. Families, already fractured by sales and punishments, bore the added burden of this enforced lineage, children born into a legacy of calculated suffering. Elias gathered them in fleeting moments under the guise of mending tools in the smithy, where he shared tales of endurance from his New Orleans days, stories of root doctors who turned poison into protection, their wisdom a defiant thread connecting the scattered diaspora. These gatherings fostered a fragile resilience, a shared memory that countered the isolation the program imposed, yet each whisper carried peril, one wrong word, and the lash or the auctioneer's gavel would descend. Jeremiah Hawthorne's paranoia bloomed in the cold winds, manifesting in midnight searches of the quarters. He summoned Elias to the big house one fog-shrouded evening, the study lit by a fire that cast flickering shadows on portraits of stern ancestors. "Your tricks saved my property," Jeremiah said, his voice laced with false camaraderie. A glass of corn liquor pressed into Elias's hand. "But don't think it buys freedom." The fever was a warning, perhaps from above, perhaps from below. Elias stood impassive, reading the fear in the man's eyes, not just of loss, but of exposure. Lydia hovered in the doorway, her ledger clutched like a shield, her gaze appraising the healer as one might a troublesome mule. She knew the pact's fragility. A whisper to the wrong ear in town could unravel the network of complicity that shielded them all. The local gentry, merchants, lawyers, even the circuit judge, profited from the silence, their ledgers balanced on Hawthorne cotton, their sermons extolling the divine order of labor. As the year turned, the first overt cracks appeared. A field hand, emboldened by Elias's example, refused a decreed pairing. His protest met with a public punishment that echoed through the pines, a spectacle designed to reinforce the hierarchy. Elias tended the man's wounds in secret, applying poultices of willow and comfrey, but the incident rippled outward. Overseer Tate, nursing his own grievances against Jeremiah's parsimony, began feeding rumors to the town tavern, tales of unnatural cures and gatherings that smacked of insurrection. These seeds of betrayal, nurtured by the system's divisions, ensured that no unified front could form. The enslaved, pitted against each other through rewards and reprisals, internalized the silence, their stories preserved in coded songs, hummed over washboards, or scratched into barnwood, enduring artifacts of a memory the official record would bury. Elias's journal grew thicker, its pages a clandestine archive of the program's machinery. Voss's visits tallied by date, the pact's participants named in veiled terms, the human cost etched in names like Mira and Josiah. He hid it beneath a loose floorboard, knowing discovery meant the end. The plantation's elite veil held firm, with county clerks recording only bountiful yields and orderly births, omitting the fevers, the separations, the elixirs that tainted bloodlines. Decades would pass before such truths surfaced. In 1923, a fire in the Hawthorne attic spared Lydia's ciphered ledger, only for it to moulder in a bank vault until a descendant's probate unearthed it in 2005. There, the pacts stood revealed, agreements that traded lives for profit, enforced by physicians who blurred healing into horror. Yet, in that winter of 1847, Elias clung to the spark he had kindled. The children's survival was no mere accident. It was a testament to the forbidden knowledge that outlasted chains. As snow dusted the fields, he plotted in shadows, weighing flight against the duty to those whose lives he had woven back from the brink. The plague of the plantation, its pacts, its silences, demanded more than cures. It called for a reckoning, one that would echo through generations, emerging from forgotten graves and yellowed pages to challenge the myths of a benevolent South. The healer's path grew narrower, but his resolve burned steady, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of Erisha. Spring unfurled over the Hawthorne plantation in 1848 with a deceptive gentleness, wild azaleas blooming along the fence lines like forgotten promises amid the red clay furrows. The fields, freshly turned for planting, bore the scars of winter's idleness, but the rhythm of bondage resumed with mechanical precision. Elias the healer, demoted to the plough gangs after the overseer's scrutiny intensified, gripped the wooden handles until his palms blistered, his mind a whirlwind of guarded secrets. The children's cure lingered in the quarters like a half-remembered dream, their strengthened bodies now bent to the soil. But the spark of unity he had fostered simmered beneath the surface. Whispers passed during water breaks. Tales of the healer's bruise that had chased away the shadows served as quiet affirmations of survival against the plantation's unyielding grind. Elias's hidden journal became his anchor in those grueling days, its pages swelling with observations that peeled back the layers of the breeding program's insidious design. He chronicled the arrivals of Dr. Voss with the meticulousness of a man charting a storm's path, the physician's buggy rattling through the gates under moonless skies, his satchel clinking with vials that promised enhancement but delivered affliction. From Eliza's continued confessions in the weaving shed, Elias learned of the pact's broader reach, a network woven through county seats and steamboat routes, where planters like the Hawthorns bartered knowledge of treatments as freely as seed stock. Voss, a shadowy figure with a reputation in Savannah's medical circles for experimental zeal, tailored his elixirs to the elite's needs. Compounds to hasten pregnancies, suppress unrest in the young, or ensure offspring suited to endless toil. Lydia Hawthorne's ciphered entries, relayed through a house servant's risky whispers, revealed her as the architect's hand, pairings selected not just for strength, but for compliance with Voss's interventions sealing the design. The human drama unfolded in the stolen moments of respite, where the weight of these machinations pressed like an invisible burden. Elias encountered it in the form of young Josiah, now tasked with tending the big house's herb garden, his small frame taut with unspoken fears. During a midday lull, as overseers dozed in the shade, Josiah slipped Elias a crumpled note, scratched in charcoal on a rag, detailing a recent examination in the attic. The boy described the physician's probing questions about dreams and loyalties, followed by a bitter draft that left him listless for days. "It makes the fire inside go quiet," Josiah murmured, his voice cracking like dry earth. Elias recognized the toll, a deliberate dulling of spirit, ensuring the bred children grew into laborers whose horizons ended at the plantation's edge. Families, already splintered by sales to settle debts or quell murmurs, bore this added fracture. Mothers watching their young drift into apathy, fathers separated before bonds could form roots of resistance. In the quarters, the silence was a communal shroud, enforced by fear and the complicity of those who survived by blending into the shadows. Elias observed how the overseers, Men like Tate, whose own lives teetered on the edge of ruin, internalized the system's cruelties to justify their roles. Tate, in a rare moment of unguarded talk by the well, boasted of the pact's efficiency. Keeps the numbers up without the mess of runaways getting ideas. Yet, beneath his bluster lay a hollow echo, a man complicit in the erasure that spared no one. The town beyond the gates mirrored this veil. Merchants tallied Hawthorne cotton without inquiry, their ledgers a sanitized narrative of prosperity. Church gatherings, where Jeremiah Hawthorne donated pews and alms, invoked blessings on the harmonious order, omitting the fevers, the separations, the elixirs that coursed through veins like silent poisons. Official records from the county courthouse, sparse and selective, listed births as windfalls, deaths as misfortunes, burying the program's machinery under layers of omission. Elias's resistance deepened in secrecy, his illegal trick evolving from cure to quiet subversion. He began dispersing diluted essences, slips of mayapple root hidden in cornbread, sassafras leaves tucked into work aprons, to counter the lingering effects of Voss's treatments. These acts, small as they seemed, wove a thread of agency through the community, reminding the enslaved that their bodies held secrets the masters could not fully claim. During evening prayers in the cabins, disguised as scripture readings, Elias shared fragments from his journal, the pact's names, the dates of Voss's visits, the patterns of affliction that linked fevers to the breeding edicts. Listeners, faces etched with the lines of endurance, absorbed it like parched soil drinking rain, knowledge as nourishment against despair. One woman, whose daughter had been paired against her pleas, clutched Elias's arm. "This fire you carry, it warms the cold places they've hollowed out." Yet, each sharing risked exposure. The overseers patrolled more vigilantly, their dogs straining at leashes, sniffing for dissent in the night air. As the planting season peaked, tension coiled like a spring in the big house. Jeremiah Hawthorne, receiving correspondence from fellow planters about rising abolitionist whispers in the North, grew irritable, his temper flaring at minor infractions. Lydia, ever the strategist, proposed tightening the program's reins, more frequent Voss visits, stricter pairings to offset any unruly elements. She confided in her husband of a letter from the Latimore estate, proposing a joint assessment to refine their methods, a pact extension that promised shared resilience against economic shifts. Elias overheard this through the thin walls during a forced errand to the study, the words igniting a resolve to document more furiously. His journal now included sketches of the attic's layout, notes on the physician's routes, hints of a larger network that spanned Georgia's Black Belt. It was a map of shadows, a denunciation poised to outlive him. The persistence of memory flickered in these acts, a counterpoint to the forgetting the system demanded. Oral threads, songs hummed in the fields, riddles shared among children, preserved the healer's triumph over the fever, evolving into lore that mocked the official silence. But the elite's complicity held firm, their pacts a bulwark against scrutiny. Historians would later trace these alliances in unsealed archives from the 1850s, dusty files revealing exchanges that treated lives as commodities, but in 1848 they remained buried, sustained by the fear that bound communities in quiet betrayal. Elias, ploughing under the relentless sun, felt the noose of inevitability. His cures had illuminated the darkness, but the plantation's plague of control and erasure demanded a steeper price. As rain clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a downpour to wash the fields clean, he wondered how long the spark could burn before the storm extinguished it. The children's eyes, meeting his across the rows, held a plea for more than endurance, for a truth that might one day shatter the silence. Emerging from hidden pages and forgotten graves, to demand the justice long denied. Summer deepened on the hawthorn plantation in 1848, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and the relentless creak of wagon wheels hauling cotton to the gin. The fields stretched like endless wounds under the Georgia sun, their furrows etched deeper by the hands that toiled without cease. Elias the healer, his frame leaner now from the unyielding labor of the plough gangs, moved through the rows with a deliberate slowness, his eyes tracing patterns in the earth that spoke of hidden paths and buried truths. The children's cure had become a legend, whispered in the shadows of the quarters, a fragile beacon amid the gathering storm. But Elias felt the weight of exposure pressing closer, like the humid breath of an approaching gale. His journal, concealed beneath the floorboards of his cabin, had grown into a chronicle of quiet fury, a ledger of its own, countering Lydia Hawthorne's sanitized records. Night after night, by the flicker of a smuggled candle stub, Elias inscribed the details that clawed at his conscience, the precise dates of Dr. Voss's nocturnal arrivals, the roster of pairings enforced with cold precision, the subtle poisons that lingered in the blood of the bred young. From Josiah's furtive notes and Eliza's guarded tales in the weaving shed, he mapped the pact's insidious sprawl, a confederacy of planters who met in veiled gatherings at crossroads taverns, exchanging not just stock, but strategies to perpetuate their dominion. The Latimores to the north had pledged a share of their enhanced offspring in return for Voss's latest formulations, compounds whispered to include traces of lead to steady the temperament. Lydia's cipher, pieced together from overheard fragments, revealed her as the scribe of this shadow economy, her entries a blueprint for control, disguised as benevolence. The human echoes of these machinations reverberated through the daily grind, manifesting in the hollow gazes of those touched by the program's reach. Elias saw it in the way Sarah, the midwife whose hands had steadied so many births under duress, faltered during a delivery in the quarter's dim confines. The infant emerged frail, its cries weak against the fever that had shadowed its mother's womb, a remnant of Voss's interventions administered months prior to fortify the line. Sarah's eyes met Elias's as she wrapped the child in a ragged blanket, her voice a broken murmur. They shape us like clay, but the fire cracks what they mold. Families, already sundered by the auction block's whim, carried this deeper rift. Siblings paired unnaturally to swell the ranks, their bonds twisted into tools of production rather than ties of blood. Mira, now 11 and assigned to the big house kitchens, slipped Elias wild berries during a rare errand, her small voice laced with the poison of isolation. The songs you taught us fade when the doctor comes. He says we'll forget the old ways. These confessions wove a tapestry of loss, where resilience flickered against the deliberate fracturing of spirits, the enslaved reduced to vessels in a cycle that devoured their humanity. In the broader silence of the community, the plantation's secrets festered unchecked, a complicity woven into the fabric of rural life. The overseers, men like Tate, whose loyalty was bought with scraps of authority, patrolled the borders with renewed vigor, their reports to Jeremiah Hawthorne laced with innuendo about unrest in the healer's wake. Tate had taken to lingering near Elias's cabin, his boots thudding like accusations on the packed dirt, sniffing for signs of the forbidden gatherings that had once knit the children together. The townfolk, bound by their own precarious alliances, blacksmiths forging chains, merchants weighing bales without question, upheld the veil. Sunday services in the whitewashed chapel rang with hymns of providence, Jeremiah's donations ensuring sermons that praised the divine hierarchy of labor, omitting the fevers that scarred generations. County ledgers, penned by clerks who owed their positions to Hawthorne influence, tallied assets with mechanical detachment, births as increments, ailments as footnotes, the pact's machinery erased in favor of a narrative of orderly abundance. This collective forgetting was no accident. It was the system's armor, shielding elites from the gaze of a nation teetering on the edge of fracture. Elias's subversion deepened in the face of this encroaching darkness, his illegal trick transforming from mere remedy into a veiled arsenal. He dispersed countermeasures with cunning subtlety, infusions of dogwood bark hidden in the communal water gourds to purge the lingering toxins from Voss's elixirs. Talismans of knotted roots pressed into the palms of the young during fleeting encounters in the fields. These acts were sparks of defiance, reminding the enslaved that their inherited wisdom could pierce the fog of control. In the hush of midnight, when the overseer's lanterns dimmed, Elias reconvened small circles in the underbrush beyond the fences, disguised as foraging parties, but alive with the exchange of stories that preserved the unyielding thread of memory. One elder, her face lined like ancient bark, recounted the Middle Passage's horrors, her words a bridge to the ancestors whose herbs Elias now wielded. "We carry the roots in our veins," she said, her grip firm on his arm. "They can't burn what grows from within." Yet each meeting heightened the peril. Dogs bayed in the distance, and shadows shifted unnaturally, hinting at eyes that watched from the tree line. Jeremiah Hawthorne's unease crystallized into action as the season waned, his consultations with Voss growing more frequent, their discussions in the study a murmur of contingency plans. Lydia, sensing the fragility of their web, advocated for preemptive measures, reassigning Elias to the remote canebrakes where isolation might snuff his influence. But Voss, with his clinical detachment, urged a bolder stroke, administering a corrective to the healer himself to test the limits of his storied resilience. Elias gleaned this from a house servant's trembling report, the words igniting a fever in his own blood. He accelerated his documentation, sketching maps of escape routes that snaked through the swamps toward free territories, even as loyalty anchored him to the children whose lives he had reclaimed. The journal now held the pact's full contour, names of allied estates, dates of exchanges, the human calculus that valued lives in bushels of cotton. As August's heat peaked, the noose tightened inexorably. An overseer's raid on the quarters unearthed a scrap of Elias's talisman, buried near a child's pallet, a carved root that screamed of conjure in their fearful eyes. Accusations flew like sparks from a whip. Witchcraft, sabotage, a healer's hubris that threatened the sacred order. Elias was dragged to the barn, where he had once wrought his miracle, bound and questioned under the glare of lanterns, his silence a final act of resistance. The children's eyes, peering from the shadows, held a mix of terror and the unquenchable spark he had kindled, a silent vow that the truths he had unearthed would not perish with him. In the days that followed, Elias vanished into the night, his fate swallowed by the plantation's maw, listed in the ledgers as fled. But the seeds he planted endured, buried deep, awaiting the rains of time to unearth them from the silence of history's grave. If this story has gripped you already, leave a like. It helps the story of Elias the Healer reach more people. The autumn winds of 1848 swept through the Hawthorne plantation like mournful elegies, stripping the oaks bare and scattering leaves across the fields where lives had been bent and broken. Elias the Healer was gone, his absence a void that echoed through the quarters, marked only by the overseer's triumphant snarls and the ledger's curt notation of flight. The children he had pulled from the fever's jaws now toiled in silence, their small frames hardened by the season's demands, but in their hushed exchanges lingered the fragments of his teachings, herbs identified by touch, songs that wove resilience into the night. The plantation carried on, its machinery of control grinding forward, the breeding program's shadows lengthening under Lydia Hawthorne's unyielding gaze. Pairings continued, enforced with the same clinical detachment. Dr. Voss's buggy tracing familiar ruts to the big house, his elixirs promising order amid the whispers of unrest that rippled from northern abolitionist pamphlets smuggled in cotton bales. Yet, Elias's journal, that clandestine testament etched in desperation, did not perish with him. Buried beneath the cabin's floorboards, it survived the winter's floods and the spring's careless renovations, its bark pages curling like forgotten prayers. The healer's words chronicled not just the fever's defeat, but the deeper affliction, the pacts that bound elites in a web of calculated cruelty, trading human potential for profit's gleam. He named the players, the Grimshaw's exchanges, the Lattimore's quotas, Voss's toxic innovations, veiling them in codes drawn from field patterns and star alignments, a healer's cipher against the overseer's prying eyes. In the quarters, the oral thread endured. Mothers taught daughters the illegal trick's echoes, blending sassafras with ancestral chants to counter the lingering pallor in their young. But the silence imposed by fear was profound, a communal hush that stretched across generations, the enslaved internalizing the erasure as survival's bitter price. Decades folded upon themselves, the Civil War's thunder shattering the South's illusions, but leaving Hawthorne's secrets intact amid the ruins. The plantation fragmented into tenant farms, its grand house sagging under vines, Jeremiah and Lydia long dust in a family plot unmarked by the truths they guarded. Their descendants, scattered to Atlanta's sprawl or the North's factories, inherited land deeds pristine as the official histories that celebrated the old order's civilizing mission. The breeding pacts faded into myth, dismissed as wartime exaggerations or the fevered fancy of the defeated. County archives, rebuilt after Sherman's march, tallied losses in bales and battles, omitting the human calculus that had sustained the fields. The town, rebuilt with Yankee capital, erected monuments to reconciliation, their inscriptions silent on the graves of the bred and the broken. Complicity lingered in the everyday, descendants of overseers like Tate becoming local officials, their family lore glossing over the whips and whispers, while the enslaved's kin, freed but fettered by sharecropping, carried the scars in unspoken songs passed at church suppers. The first fissures appeared in the early 20th century, subtle as cracks in parched earth. In 1923, a fire gutted the Hawthorne attic, sparing Lydia's ciphered ledger amid the ashes, a leather-bound relic that found its way into a Savannah bank vault, labeled as estate trivia. It molded there, ignored by appraisers more interested in silver than shadows, until the Great Depression forced auctions of forgotten heirlooms. A distant niece, scraping by in the city's tenements, claimed it, stashing the volume in her trunk where it gathered dust through the wars and the civil rights marches. Oral memories persisted in the black communities that sprang from the quarter's soil, elders recounting the healer's miracle around potbelly stoves. Elias called the roots from the old lands, cured what the white doctor's poison wrought. These tales, fragmented and fierce, wove through migrations to Chicago and Detroit, a resilient vein against the great, forgetting that textbooks enforced, slavery's horrors reduced to statistics, its intimate cruelties airbrushed into progress narratives. Persistence bloomed in unlikely soil. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement unearthed mass graves from Selma to Birmingham, a young historian named Clara Beaumont, descended from Hawthorne field hands through a line of laundresses, stumbled upon the plantation's subdivided lots during a land rights survey. Her shovel struck not just clay, but the shallow pit from 1847, bones mingled with talisman shards and chain links, the 87's fragile proof. Carbon dating tied them to the fever summer, their malformations whispering of Voss's elixirs. subtle deformities from heavy metals etched into tiny skeletons like accusations. Clara's reports, dismissed at first as sensationalism by white academies, gained traction through black newspapers and oral history projects, linking the finds to the breeding program's ghosts. Faith drove her. Nights poring over microfiche in dim libraries, interviewing elders whose grandparents had known Mira and Josiah, piecing the packs from faded letters in family Bibles. The true reckoning dawned in 2018 when Clara's great-niece, a tenacious archivist in Atlanta, unsealed the probate files from that long-ago vault. Lydia's ledger emerged, its ciphers cracked by digital tools and Elias's own hidden key, patterns Clara had preserved from the dig. The pages spilled forth, Voss's visits detailed as protocols, pairings as yields, the fevers as culls in the elite's grim arithmetic. Cross-referenced with Voss's own trial records, buried in Savannah courts for unrelated quackery, the document revealed the network's breadth, a betrayal spanning Georgia's heartland, shielded by lawyers and judges who profited from the silence. Descendants of the enslaved, long denied reparations, filed suits that cracked open more archives. Grimshaw diaries confessing exchanges, Lattimore ledgers tallying enhanced stock. The revelations rippled outward, documentaries and books giving voice to the silenced, the Healer's Journal, unearthed in a 2022 cabin restoration, emerging as the capstone, its words a bridge from 1848 to the present. In the epilogue of this shadowed saga, memory triumphs over forgetting, a tardy justice that honors the persistence of those who refused erasure. Elias's illegal trick was no mere cure. It was a declaration of the enslaved's profound wisdom, a rebellion against the pacts that commodified souls. The Hawthorne Plantation's fields, now community gardens and memorials, stand as testament. Plaques etched with the 87's names, gardens of sassafras and mayapple blooming where chains once rusted. Betrayal's architects, elites and their enablers, lie exposed in the light of unsealed truths, their complicity a caution against history's selective gaze. For the descendants who carry Elias's spark, faith in revelation endures, turning graves into gardens of reckoning. The silence breaks, not with thunder, but with voices rising from the soil, reminders that what was buried persists, demanding we listen to the echoes of resilience that outlasted the darkness. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Hawthorne Plantation. See you in the next video.